American Skyways Flight 191 lifted off from Phoenix at 7:42 p.m., scheduled to land in Chicago before midnight. It was a late, quiet, west to Midwest flight, the kind people booked when they wanted an empty seat beside them, a calm night sky, and a few hours of peace above the world. The aircraft, an AS-9 long-range twinjet, hummed steadily down the runway as orange desert light faded behind the mountains. Everything about Flight 191 felt ordinary, routine, predictable. And maybe that's why no one noticed the first warning: the temperature drop inside the cabin before takeoff. Passengers brushed it off as air conditioning. The crew assumed the terminal gate had been cold, but the cameras at the gate later showed something else: a strange distortion in the air around the aircraft door, a ripple like heat haze. Except it was freezing cold. Inside, the passengers settled into their seats. Business travelers opened laptops. A retired couple played cards. A college girl slept with headphones still playing. No one noticed the frost forming on the window of seat 18A. Not on the outside of the glass, but on the inside. A thin gray pattern, like frozen smoke, drifting across the plastic. It faded before takeoff, as if it knew people were looking. The climb was uneventful, smooth, silent, too silent. At 22,000 feet, the flight attendants whispered to each other about how strangely quiet the engines sounded, as if their noise were being swallowed before reaching human ears. But the gauges read perfectly normal. Turbines spinning at standard RPM, fuel flow stable, electrical systems without faults. Only the cabin temperature gauge behaved strangely. Every 5 minutes it dipped sharply, sometimes below freezing, then corrected itself without input. Passengers began using blankets. Some rubbed their hands to stay warm. A baby cried uncontrollably as the cold wrapped around the cabin like a living breath. Yet the pilots saw nothing unusual on their systems panel. They couldn't feel the cold from the cockpit. Their instruments didn't indicate a failure. It was as if the cabin existed in a different atmosphere entirely. Then came the first blackout. Lights flickered once, twice. Then the cabin fell into complete darkness for exactly 6 seconds. 6 seconds of pitch-black silence. 6 seconds without engine sound. 6 seconds where passengers felt the aircraft suspended in nothingness. When the lights returned, 3 people reported the same thing. Someone had been standing in the aisle during the darkness. Tall, motionless, featureless in the faint emergency glow. But when the lights stabilized, no one was there. The aisle was empty. At 31,000 feet, the pilots adjusted heading for Chicago, but the compass reading suddenly drifted 5 degrees, then 10, then 30. The aircraft corrected itself automatically, but the correction came without pilot input. The control column moved on its own, subtly, gently, as though guided by invisible hands. Captain Hale and First Officer Ramirez stared at the controls. "What was that?" Hale whispered. Ramirez didn't answer. He was staring out the window. There was nothing outside. No lights, no stars, no clouds. Just blackness so deep it looked like the plane was flying through a tunnel of pure void. The weather radar malfunctioned. The GPS froze. And then the horizon disappeared from the cockpit entirely. Passengers noticed it too. The windows no longer showed night sky or faint distant lights on the ground. They showed nothing, a void. Darkness thick enough that some passengers pressed their hands to the glass, convinced a black sheet had been placed over the windows. At 8:22 p.m., the aircraft vanished from radar. No transponder, no SOS, no emergency descent, no explosion, just absence. Air traffic control called repeatedly. No answer. They switched channels. No answer. Then they switched to the emergency guard channel. And finally, a response came through. But it was not the pilots' voices. A low, layered whisper filled the frequency. "Flight 191, not alone." Static slammed the channel. The transmission ended. Inside the cabin, the cold intensified again, far more violently this time. Frost burst across overhead bins. Seats iced over. Passengers' breath formed thick clouds. The temperature dropped so fast that metal armrests began to freeze burned skin on contact. Then, the footsteps began. Slow. Rhythmic. Walking down the aisle from the rear of the plane, a passenger stood to look. He froze in place. His face went pale. Behind him, emerging from the darkness, was the silhouette again. But this time, it was clearer, taller, colder. Its form bending wrong, like limbs sculpted from fog. Every passenger watched in terror as it extended an impossibly long arm and dragged its icy hand across the seatbacks, leaving lines of frost that crawled across the fabric like living veins. The entity stopped at row 23, turned its head, stared directly at the passengers, and whispered in a voice colder than the void outside, "Descent forbidden." At that exact moment, the aircraft dropped violently, as if pushed from above. Gravity vanished. Passengers floated. Screams filled the icy cabin. The engines roared unnaturally, deepening in pitch as though echoing through a canyon. The aircraft was no longer in normal sky. It was falling through something else, a place between worlds, a place colder than space, a place where Flight 191 did not belong. And then, everything inside the cabin went silent. The windows went white, and the aircraft crossed into the place it was never meant to enter. When Flight 191 fell out of normal sky, the world outside the windows transformed instantly. It wasn't cloud. It wasn't storm. It wasn't night. It was white. A blinding, infinite white that swallowed the plane like an ocean made of frozen light. The passengers shielded their eyes as the brightness bled through the cabin, washing over every seat, every surface, every trembling hand. But the white wasn't just light. It was moving, slowly, deliberately, like drifting ash or snow suspended in time. A strange hush fell over the cabin. Not calm. A silence so complete it felt unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. Then people noticed something horrifying. Their bodies weren't moving normally. A woman trying to lift her hand felt the air thicken like syrup. A man attempting to stand found his legs stiff, heavy, freezing. Children cried, but their voices came out slow. Not loud, not sharp, but stretched, as if sound itself was freezing mid-air. The passengers weren't freezing. Time was. Frost spread across their clothing in slow motion, forming patterns that grew backward, rewriting themselves, erasing themselves, blooming again. Breath clouds hung still in mid-air, like delicate white sculptures. At row 11, a teenage boy reached toward a floating water bottle that was suspended perfectly still. It didn't fall. It didn't move. It simply hovered, frozen in a world where time was no longer a constant. In the cockpit, Captain Hale stared through the windshield in disbelief. The white void pulsed like a living organism. The navigation screens flickered with symbols. Not errors, not code, but shapes forming and dissolving. Circles, triangles, spirals, patterns that didn't belong to aviation. "Are we?" First Officer Ramirez began, but the question died on his lips. Because something appeared outside, on the right wing, a shape, tall, black, featureless, standing still in the blinding white. Its presence cast no shadow. The void swallowed all darkness, yet the creature itself was darker than anything Hale had ever seen. Not black like night, but black, like the absence of existence. Ramirez whispered, trembling, "Is it the same one from the cabin?" "No," Hale whispered back. "This one was larger, and then it moved. Not toward the cabin, not toward the window, toward the engine." It stretched one long arm downward, touching the spinning turbine with a fingertip of pure void. The engine's roar softened instantly, the blades slowing as frost exploded outward like shattered diamonds. Engine 2 began freezing from the inside. Warnings flashed red. Engine, temp drop, compressor, ice thrust. Failure. But the engine didn't fail. It stopped, mid-rotation, as if time inside the turbine froze the same way it froze the cabin. Passengers felt the plane shudder violently as Flight 191 lost lift on the right side. Oxygen masks dropped, but they didn't swing. They stayed suspended in midair, frozen between motion and stillness. Then the white outside thickened. Passengers near the windows saw something moving in the brightness. Vast, slow shapes, drifting behind the veil. Not clouds, not creatures, structures. Massive pillars of light and frost twisting upward. Like the architecture of another dimension. They moved like glaciers, floating in space. Impossibly large, impossibly graceful. And behind them, something even bigger. A silhouette so massive it didn't seem to move. Not because it was still, but because it was too large to comprehend. A face, not human, not creature, not alive in any way we understand. A face made of shifting white geometry, watching the aircraft with an expression that wasn't curiosity, but recognition. It blinked, a ripple of white piercing through the void. Every oxygen mask in the cabin dropped an inch at the same time, like the plane itself flinched. Passengers screamed, though the screams came out slow and warped. Then the face spoke, not through sound, not through vibration, through time. Words formed directly into the minds of everyone on board. A voice that wasn't heard but felt. "You are inside the frozen passage." The creature on the wing turned its head sharply toward the cockpit, as if acknowledging the same voice. The white light dimmed, just a little. Then came the second message. "You were not pulled here. You were allowed." In the cockpit, Hale froze. Allowed by what? Allowed why? Before he could think, the white outside began collapsing inward, the brightness shrinking, compressing, pulling itself into a narrow corridor of blinding frost. Time in the cabin began to move again, fast-forwarding in a violent snap. Breath clouds shattered, droplets fell. Passengers screamed in real time. Seatbelts shook, bags tumbled. A baby wailed. Time had restarted, violently. And as it did, a third message struck the minds of the crew and passengers. "Do not descend!" But the aircraft had already begun dropping. Smoke erupted from the frozen engine. The second engine sputtered. The nose dipped. And through the collapsing white corridor, Hale saw something impossible. Beneath the void, beneath the light, beneath the world they had fallen through. Chicago. The city appeared like a mirage, visible but distant, distorted by cold, glitching in and out of view. Flight 191 was falling toward Earth again. But the creatures weren't done. As the white corridor closed, the being on the wing leaped, vanishing into the brightness. But something else entered the aircraft. A shadow, a cold, a presence. Passengers felt it before they saw it, walking slowly down the aisle. As the white corridor collapsed and Earth's sky returned, the inside of Flight 191 transformed once more. Not back to normal, but into a hybrid state where time flowed unevenly, air trembled with cold, and a presence moved through the cabin with slow, deliberate silence. The first sign of the presence was the breath of the passengers, thick white vapor drifting from their mouths, curling upward like smoke, then stopping midair, frozen in place, suspended like cold ghosts. A woman in row 14 screamed, but her scream came out, delayed, as if the sound had to push through layers of frozen time before reaching the air. The shadow entered the cabin, not from the aisle, not from the cockpit, not from the doors. It stepped out of the white, emerging directly through the sealed metal wall, like the wall wasn't solid. A tall, thin silhouette of shifting darkness, not black, not frost, something between the two, cold given shape. Passengers closest to it froze instantly, their bodies stiffening as a glaze of frost swept across their faces. Their eyes stayed open, staring, alive but trapped, breathing but immobilized, prisoners in their own bodies. The creature moved slowly down the aisle, its limbs bending in unnatural angles, its joints cracking softly, with each movement like ice being twisted. Frost grew beneath each step, spreading across the aisle carpet in branching white veins that crawled toward the rows on either side. A man tried to unbuckle and run. He took one step. The air around him shimmered, and he froze mid-stride. His body suspended diagonally, breath cloud hanging before him like a frozen memory. A child cried out for her mother. The creature tilted its head slowly toward the sound. The crying slowed, thickened, stopped mid-sob. Only her eyes still moved, wide, terrified, trapped in time. It wasn't killing them. It was holding them, preserving them, like samples. Captain Hale's voice cracked through the intercom. "Everyone stay calm. We're descending into Chicago airspace." But the intercom distorted. The words twisted. Return to the cabin warped and layered with a second voice underneath his. "Do not descend." It wasn't Hale speaking. It was the presence, using his voice, using the aircraft. In the cockpit, Hale and Ramirez were fighting the controls again. The aircraft resisted descent as if a force beneath it was pushing upward. The altimeter shook violently. Chicago lights flickered in and out of view, shifting positions as if the city itself were glitching. Ramirez looked at the radar. He went silent. A massive, dark signature hovered beneath Flight 191, bigger than any plane, bigger than any structure. A void, a cold zone. It followed their every move. "Is that the ground?" Ramirez whispered. "No," Hale said. His voice trembled. "The ground doesn't move." Behind them, the cockpit door was beginning to frost. Not from outside temperature, not from air pressure, from something approaching. The creature in the cabin had changed direction. It was moving toward the cockpit. Passengers saw it slide down the aisle, its head scraping the ceiling as it elongated, its body stretching like shadow on melting snow. Every few seconds it flickered, not like a glitch, but like it existed in multiple frames at once. Its hands touched seatbacks as it passed, leaving behind sharp, jagged ice that glowed faintly. At row 7, the creature paused. It turned, looked, directly at a woman wearing a silver locket. The locket froze solid instantly, then shattered into metallic dust. The creature wasn't reacting randomly. It was searching. Searching for what? A man near the front whispered a prayer. The words came out wrong, slowed, echoing backward and forward. And the creature turned toward him. It raised its long, ice-black hand. And 3 rows of passengers froze completely. Frost crawled over their lips. Their breath stilled. Their hearts slowed to a near standstill. But they did not die. They remained conscious. Trapped inside their own frozen bodies, eyes wide, minds screaming silently. The aircraft lurched downward. Chicago lights surged upward. Altitude, 9,000 feet, 8,500, 8,000. They were falling fast. Too fast. Hale tried to regain control. "We're descending too steeply. Engines responding slow. Hydro's cold." Ramirez stared at him, not at the controls. At Hale's breath. It wasn't drifting like normal breath. It lifted upward, then curved toward the cockpit door. As if drawn. As if something behind the door was inhaling. The creature was inches away. A soft scraping echoed along the metal. Cold seeped underneath the door. The frost thickened. Then the voice returned. Not through the intercom, not from outside. Directly into Hale and Ramirez's minds. Cold, layered, heavy. "Turn back!" Hale gritted his teeth. "We can't. We're too low." "Turn back." Ramirez shook his head. "Back where? Into that void?" The voice deepened. "Back to where you belong." The aircraft shuddered. The controls stiffened. The nose lifted sharply on its own. Something was fighting the descent. Something wanted the aircraft to return. But the engines were failing. Time was unstable. Passengers were frozen. And Chicago airspace was too close. The frost creature pressed its hand to the cockpit door. The metal groaned. Frost spiraled outward in branching patterns. The door bent inward. Hale reached for the emergency axe. And then the creature whispered a final message through the door. "The city below is not safe from us." The cockpit lights blew out. The door burst open, and the presence stepped inside. The moment the cockpit door burst inward, a wave of frozen air surged into the flight deck like a living force. Frost exploded across the ceiling panels. The instrument screens dimmed, and every warning light flickered simultaneously. Not from electrical failure, but from pressure. Pressure that felt like time itself was bending around the aircraft. Captain Hale shielded his eyes as the shadow stepped into the cockpit. It was taller now. Too tall for the space it entered. Its form bent at impossible angles to fit inside, limbs stretching, spine curving like a ribbon of darkness. Frost pulsed from its body in slow, rhythmic waves, each one dimming the cockpit lights further until everything glowed blue-white. Ramirez, backed against the panel, chest heaving. It's inside, Captain." The creature turned its head sharply toward him. Not a movement of curiosity. Not a movement of aggression. A movement of recognition. Like it had seen him before. Like it remembered him. Ramirez froze mid-breath. Not physically. His breath literally froze in the air and hung there, suspended, unmoving. His eyes widened in horror. He tried to inhale, but the air resisted him. Thick, heavy, frozen in temperature and time. The creature lifted one hand. Long, thin fractal fingers extended outward, like icicles growing in reverse. Hale swung the emergency axe. The blade passed through the creature's arm, as if cutting fog. But the fog reacted. It flared. The cold pulsed outward violently. The axe froze solid in Hale's hands. His gloves frosted instantly. His fingertips burned as the metal chilled to deathly temperatures. The creature turned to Hale now. Its face, featureless, hollow, bent forward so close he could see swirling white geometry inside it, like someone had carved a face out of a glacier and given it a pulse. A whisper bled into the cockpit, not from the creature's mouth. It had none, but from every surface around them. "You were warned!" The altimeter spun downward violently. 7,000 feet. 6,800, 6,500. Chicago's lights glowed through the cockpit window. Distorted, bending, glitching as if the city existed behind a sheet of fractured ice. Ramirez collapsed to his knees. He whispered, voice trembling, "It's not letting us land. It won't let us reach the city." And then, the radar lit up. A massive dark object filled the display. Not above the aircraft, not behind, directly underneath. Shape, unknown, altitude, climbing speed, matching 191 classification, not aircraft, a void, a rising void. A second presence. Hale stared at the radar, voice shaking. "What is that?" Then the void spoke, through every radio frequency, every cabin speaker, every electrical wire inside the aircraft, not in words, in patterns. A sequence of tones so low they vibrated in human bones. A resonance that felt ancient, mathematical, sentient. The creature inside the cockpit reacted instantly. It straightened, flickered, and lowered its head as if bowing to whatever approached from below. Ramirez whispered, "Is it another one?" "No," Hale said slowly. "It's bigger." Then everything outside the aircraft changed. The fracture in the sky. A crack formed in the sky. Not lightning, not turbulence. A literal fracture. A jagged line of black slicing through the clouds like the sky itself was glass, breaking open. Light spilled from the crack. Cold spilled from the crack. Shapes moved behind it. Massive silhouettes drifting past like frozen continents. The creature in the cockpit raised both arms toward the fracture. Its form expanded, splitting into multiple shadow layers, as if it were shedding versions of itself. Then, for the first time, it spoke with its own voice. "They come." The fracture widened. Hale yanked the controls, trying to pull the aircraft away, but the yoke felt weightless, useless, irrelevant, as if the plane no longer existed in a world where physics mattered. 6,000 feet, 5,700, 5,300. Chicago's skyline bent unnaturally, towers stretching upward, like reflections rippling in water. The void beneath them surged upward. The fracture above them widened. Flight 191 was caught between two impossible worlds. One below, one above. Both pulling, both calling. Ramirez forced himself to stand. His breath returned briefly. He grabbed Hale's arm. "Captain, if the fracture opens completely..." Hale knew. They wouldn't just crash. They would vanish. Completely. Permanently. Into whichever world reached them first. The cockpit suddenly vibrated as the creature stepped forward again. It placed a long hand on the windshield. Frost crawled outward in branching patterns. Lines, symbols, geometric shapes. The same symbols Ramirez saw inside the white void. A message. Ramirez whispered, reading the patterns through shaking lips. Not safe. Not ready. Not allowed. The creature turned its hollow face toward the city below, and its form flickered with agitation. It didn't want Chicago touched. The void below disagreed. The fracture above widened. Reality trembled. Flight 191 was splitting between two dimensions. Passengers screamed as oxygen masks ripped sideways, sucked toward the ceiling. The aisle lights spiraled. Seatbelts snapped. Frost exploded across the windows. The creature in the cockpit turned back to Hale and Ramirez. It reached out a finger and touched the control panel. A single switch flipped. The autopilot. But not the aircraft's autopilot. Something else. Something that wasn't part of the plane. The controls locked instantly. The engines went silent. The aircraft stopped falling. Hale gasped. Ramirez staggered back. The creature said one final phrase. "Removed." And Flight 191 blinked out of existence. No descent, no crash, no explosion, just disappearance. From radar, from sky, from Earth. When Flight 191 blinked out of existence, the air it once occupied collapsed inward with a violent compression. Radar screens snapped to zero. The transponder flatlined. ATC logs registered a momentary electromagnetic pulse. Small, precise, impossible. Controllers stared helplessly at an empty patch of sky that 1 second held an aircraft, and the next, nothing. No debris, no flame, no signal, no sound. The official report would later call it loss of contact. But the truth was much worse. Flight 191 left Earth's dimension. Inside the aircraft, passengers felt everything freeze. Not their bodies, not their breath, not their minds. Reality froze. Color vanished first, light next, sound last. The aircraft drifted in a place without direction, pressure, or gravity. A place where the white void had meaning, an architecture of frozen time, drifting structures, and watchers made of cold geometry. Passengers sat unmoving, suspended between seconds, unable to think, unable to speak. But they were conscious, fully aware. They existed in a moment that wouldn't move. Hale and Ramirez floated weightlessly in the cockpit, staring into a windshield that showed no clouds, no stars, no sky. Just rolling shapes of white frost forming patterns too perfect to be natural and too alien to be human. The frost creature reappeared in front of them. But now, it no longer looked like a single entity. Its form split into layers, dozens of outlines overlapping, shifting with every pulse of the void. 1,000 versions of itself existing at once. It communicated directly into their minds. You were taken to prevent collision. Collision with what? The fracture? The void below? Chicago itself? Hale tried to speak, but no sound escaped his throat. Your world cannot withstand our passage. Its head tilted, the geometric void where its face should be shimmering with shifting symbols. Ramirez's eyes filled with tears, but the tears froze against his skin, drifting upward in slow motion. Returning you has cost us much. The flicker of regret shocked both pilots. Were these things protecting Earth? Protecting Chicago? Protecting time? Or protecting themselves? Before Hale could think, the void rippled. A massive silhouette moved behind the frost creature. The being from the wing. But changed. Larger, sharpened, angrier. The frost creature turned toward it. They communicated without words, a rapid pulse of shapes and vibrations. Then, everything shattered. A shockwave ripped through the void, a crack of light so intense it cut the dimension in half. The aircraft was thrown. Passengers were hurled against seats. Panels ripped loose. Frost exploded across the fuselage. Reality bent. And suddenly, the plane reappeared. At 2:14 a.m., over Lake Michigan, NORAD registered a ghost signal, a blip appearing out of nowhere, descending fast. A search helicopter spotted it first, a plane, dark, frozen, silent, gliding with no engines, Flight 191. It drifted downward like a falling leaf, touching the water so gently it barely made a splash. Rescue teams rushed in. When they breached the fuselage, what they found was beyond explanation. The passengers. They were alive, all of them, but unmoving, eyes open, breathing slow, frozen in time. Medical teams evacuated everyone, one by one. Heart rates were stable, but slowed to a fraction of normal, 20 beats per minute, some lower. Their bodies were cold but not hypothermic. It was as if their internal clocks had been slowed down. Doctors called it temporal shock. The government used a different term, cross-dimensional freeze. Passengers eventually awoke. Hours later, days later. Some a full week after rescue. When they spoke, they described the same thing. A world of white. A voice that spoke without sound. A fracture in the sky. Something huge watching them. And a warning. Do not let the sky break. Children drew pictures of shapes with no faces. Adults suffered nightmares of frozen corridors. One man refused to sleep, whispering, "They weren't angry at us. They were afraid for us." The cockpit, Hale and Ramirez were found unconscious, hands still gripping the controls. Their bodies were covered in thin frost. Their hair had frozen white. Their watches were wrong, each one showing a different date and time. But the strangest thing was the cockpit voice recorder. It captured one final message, not static, not screams, not engines, a single voice, low, layered, cold. "Returning you, remember our warning." Then a sound like shattering ice. Then nothing. The final truth, classified. Investigators discovered frost patterns on the fuselage that did not match atmospheric ice. They contained repeated geometric symbols, spirals, arcs, hollow eyes, fractures. A physicist translated the patterns into a mathematical concept, dimensional breach prevention, meaning they were saving Earth from what happened above Chicago that night. The official report sealed the truth. Flight 191 encountered a non-terrestrial dimensional anomaly. Entities intervened to prevent cross-reality contamination. The aircraft was extracted, held, and returned to earthly time. Residual risks remain. What risks? One detail was never released. When radar first detected the returning blip, it wasn't alone. A second signature appeared beside it. A cold, shifting, shadow-like mass. It followed Flight 191 into Earth's sky. It disappeared 30 seconds later, but not before transmitting one Final message. We still watch the sky. The case was closed. The passengers recovered. The world moved on. But Flight 191 never landed in Chicago. And whatever stopped it is still out there, in the cold between worlds.